Welcome to our webinar today on leadership and navigating uncertainty, featuring a friend and an excellent individual in terms of his background and what all he will be sharing with you today, Dr. Stephen Murgatroyd. He'll be the commentator, I'm the host, and we'll be discussing what leaders need to do to become and navigate this world and lead creative, agile, and socially engaging and creative organizations. So we are in a world that I think all of you are well aware is just swirling with uncertainty, whether it be the post-COVID or anticipation of COVID again, inflation, what's going on in Europe with Ukraine, climate change. I mean, the list goes on. So it's called by some a VUCA, a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity.
Okay, well, the reason I'm here is because I'm old. I'm so old, my blood type has been discontinued. 72, been working one way or another since 1973, teaching, researching, and consulting in the private sector. I ran a large strategic human resource consultancy in the UK. For 5 years, 150 management consultants, and we worked extensively around the world. I was coach to the board of Barclays Bank. I did a lot of work with Oracle and other large corporations on major transformations. So I've been in this kind of change leadership kind of world, but I've also been teaching future studies for quite some time. My big claim to fame is I was the first person in the world to launch a fully online graduate degree in St. Albert in 1993-94 for Athabasca University, the first online MBA in the world. And if you remember the internet in 1993-94, it was a bloody stupid thing to do, but it seemed to work, and it's still going, thank goodness. So I want to talk, there's two segments in this piece. One is a kind of context setting, then the other is about leadership. My big kind of idea is this is a very messy in-between time that we're in. We're in transition from a world that some of us used to know quite well and were very comfortable in, to a world that's just simply uncertain, unclear, ill-defined. So Perry mentioned the war in Ukraine. Russia launched a 2-day special operation to clear out the Nazis running Ukraine 600 days ago. Russia has essentially lost the plot. Nobody knows how that's going to end. It's an in-between time throughout Eastern Europe. We have other examples, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But I think the key idea that you need to keep in mind from a leadership perspective is how do we navigate possible, preferable, impossible futures? And I think we're not sure what the future will look like. Now, one of the things I share with my grad students is that there are lots of pasts as well. So if you're an Indigenous person in Canada, you've had a rejected and forgotten past. If you're a current new immigrant, you have an exciting, prosperous future in your mind, but the reality is somewhat different. So these are the kind of futures that we have to navigate. For example, one implausible future a year ago was that Trump might become president of the United States for a second time. The reality is there's a very good chance he could. So we don't know what the future is like. And what's happening is that we have an old way of working, this red line that's on the screen, and we have different emerging possibilities for new futures. The leadership challenge is to choose a path and to be agile and adaptive as that path unfolds. So the big opportunity for leadership is to think back from the future. What's the future we prefer, and how do we get there from where we are now? Rather than thinking of this is where we are now, what do I do next? It's let's imagine what the future could be like if we chose to behave differently, which is the big leadership challenge that we have to explore. Now, part of the reaction of the community and people in it to this kind of uncertainty that we're in is the Kubler-Ross response to death and dying. They've lost an idea of what should be in their minds, And they are now in denial or frustration or anger or depression about what the world feels like for them. So one explanation of the whole Trump phenomena and the truckers in Canada and similar kind of movements in France is this kind of sense of, I've lost what I expected my life to be, and I have no idea where it's going. I would like my life back as it was. And I think that's a kind of big underlying kind of issue that all leaders have to deal with in all organizations. Now, I'm just going to talk about 14 trends and patterns that impact everything we want to talk about in this series of webinars that Perry is organizing, whether it's healthcare, education, homelessness, community growth and development, economic development. There are some issues that impact us all, and they are significant and they are substantial. Now, there's a lot of information on these slides. I'm happy to share them with anybody that's on the call, and happy to explore any of them with you.
We will, by the way, as for the audience, and I think they're well aware of that, putting this up on YouTube. So that's another way they can get access to this.
Sure. So I'm just going to quickly run through 14 big kind of patterns. The first is the shape shifting of the global economy. When I was growing up just after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, we knew where the money was. It was in Europe, it was in North America, particularly in the United States and Britain. Not anymore. Most of the big companies are now headquartered in Asia somewhere. So companies like Dyson moved from Europe to Singapore. Large companies like Ford see Asia as their market, not North America. So they're restricting the number of models they build and sell in North America, but increasing the variety of models they sell in Asia. So we have a number of shifts that are very significant. And the most important here is that 22 of the world's largest, fastest growing cities are in Asia. And so wealth has shifted, the middle class has shifted to Asia, and that's where the money is. That's where the money is going to be. Now, part of this issue is that Canada has got a big, deep economic problem. We are stuck. I'm going to talk about a couple of features of this in a minute, but this is a quote from the OECD, reprinted in the Globe and Mail in May. By 2060, New Zealand, Italy, Estonia, the Czech Republic will be wealthier per capita than Canada if we continue on the same trajectory. Our GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation, is falling. And in other jurisdictions around the world, it's not, or not falling as fast, or is growing. So Canada's in real economic trouble, and yet nobody really talks about it. One example of this is productivity. Our productivity has been broken as a kind of idea for at least 20 years. I know Randall has worked on this kind of issue. But what we're seeing now is productivity being so poor that we're about 30%, 25 to 30% behind the US in GDP per capita produced through work. Canada's strategy is to work longer and harder. Most smart economies are working shorter and smarter. And so our fundamental labor strategy is broken. We're also falling in the world's competitive indexes. So one of the things I get my students to do is trace the history of Canada's performance on both the World Economic Forum and IMDs and all these other kind of measures of competitiveness. We have dropped from 10th place to 15th at the moment and continue to fall. The two big reasons are crumbling infrastructure and poor innovation. Now, several of us on this call have worked on the innovation portfolio for years. Canada's outstanding at invention. We really punch above our weight at creating new ideas, new products, new ways of working. What we're lousy at is converting that into economic value. What we tend to do is give that technology or sell that technology or that new development or that new drug two big producers elsewhere in the world. So we're poor at innovation, we have weak infrastructure, and we're over-regulated from a government point of view. And that's having an impact on our competitive position. This is also linked to our economic structure. This is the most recent data from Stats Canada about the size of companies in this country. We have less than 1% of our corporations that are large. What we also seem to have difficulty in doing is growing companies. We're terrific at startups, and we're pretty good at keeping them alive for about 5 to 6 years. Bankruptcy rates, closure rates are about the same as startup rates. So we're kind of net equal all the time. But we need to grow companies rather than simply create new ones. And we're not very good at that. Just look at these numbers. And this has other consequences. So because we have so many small companies, we don't spend the money on staff development and training. We don't spend the money on marketing and development. We don't spend the money on product innovation and new services, which is another reason our productivity is low. So keep this in mind, because if you're looking to lead a sector, a community, an organization, you're constrained by the environment in which you operate in. Now, I've mentioned the innovation problem. The big issue here is not that government doesn't spend on innovation, it does. Not that we don't want to encourage innovation, we do. It's that business doesn't spend on innovation. And the reason for that, most businesses are small, they don't have the cash. And so our innovation strategy, our ability to move quickly with new products, new services into the market, is constrained by the fact that businesses don't spend the kind of money. Now, I did a lot of work on this file many years ago, and we were able to show it takes $3 of private money to turn $1 of public money into an innovation asset that's sustainable in the market. And of 100 inventions that come to market, only 3 survive. And so this is a kind of big attrition problem as well, but we're not very good at this piece. One of the in-between times we're in, even despite our premier, is this whole energy transition. So whether we like it or not, we are in a transition to different kinds of sources of energy. Perry has worked for years on the fusion file. Some of us have worked for years on other kind of files to do with green energy. And new technologies, particularly battery technologies, are transforming this kind of space. But we're not moving fast enough to achieve the climate change goals that Canada has committed to. There's one of the things the Premier is dead right about is 2035 is just unrealistic, but not just for Alberta, but for most jurisdictions in the world. We're also looking at technologies like AI, quantum computing, gene editing, new materials, like all sorts of new materials. Graphene, for example, that could transform how we do things, whether it's building, whether it's business processes, whether it's flight, whether it's transportation. Technology is transforming everything we do. I wrote a paper 6 years ago called "We're All Going to Have to Learn to Dance with Robots." Well, I think we are. And just look at what AI is doing right now for healthcare. I used to work closely with the Moorfields Hospital in London, which is the world's leading eye hospital. They do all their diagnostics for eye disease through Google DeepMinds. And because of that, doctors are freed up from diagnostic work so they can treat patients faster, smarter, with better technology. Just look at the number of robotic surgeries being done around the world, especially brain surgery or heart surgery, and you'll be amazed. And we've seen nothing yet. Quantum computing is coming out as very fast. Now, I mentioned that one of the challenges that we have in Canada is a very aging infrastructure. And I think that this is an even worse problem when you look at specific sectors. So I've just finished some work for the Government of Ontario for the Blue Ribbon panel on the future of colleges and universities. And the infrastructure deficits there are huge, to the point at which some programs in science and technology and engineering may have to close because the buildings they're in are unsafe. We've just seen that in the UK, where 124 schools were closed today. because of the use of a reinforced concrete that's not reinforced and not really concrete anymore. It's crumbling away. And so we have all these kind of challenges. And linked to this are some challenges around debt cycles. Now, it's quite shocking to look at the global debt clock run by The Economist. In Canada, we have massive corporate debts, huge. I mean, but private debt, not public debt, private debt, household debt is scaring the Bank of Canada, which is one of the reasons interest rates keep going up. So if you think about the global economy, it's essentially a debt circle. We're kind of moving credit around. We're using bonds which are really funny money, to pretend that everything's fine. Now, I'm a Brit, as you probably gathered by now. Britain's been in debt since 1862, and at various points has been one of the highest performing economies in the world. I don't think debt is necessarily a bad thing. It's about the size of the debt, particularly net debt to GDP. And so we have a debt cycle problem globally, and in specific jurisdictions in Canada, we have big debt related issues, not so much here in Alberta. I mentioned the shifting geopolitical landscape. We used to know how things should play out between the superpowers. Who's a superpower now? I'm not sure. Particularly now that Boris Johnson is gone, Britain's out of the picture. So, who is the superpower? Russia? Not really. China? Possibly. But China's in economic trouble as well. So what's the geopolitical landscape? Now, these are all important from things like supply chain issues, all important from a labor supply issue, all important from a leadership dynamic kind of point of view. If you were trying to ship grain out of the Ukraine to come into Canada or other parts of the world to produce goods, dream on. It's not going to happen. Now, those are all kind of structural challenges, but we have some big people challenges as well. So our demographics in Canada are really problematic. Our fertility rate has dropped ever since Tommy Hunter came off television. My theory, by the way, is that the baby boom of the 1960s, early 1970s was because Tommy Hunter was on television. People looked at this and said, there must be something better we can do on a Saturday night. And then we had a baby boom. So either we bring Tommy Hunter back, or we have to think about whether immigration is the true solution to our fertility demographic issues. But we're aging. Look at me. I'm kind of aging. And we're aging in other kinds of ways. And not only is our infrastructure aging, but our population is aging. Now, except for BC, Alberta, and Ontario, and parts of Quebec, where we're seeing a baby boom right now. And so there's going to be a sudden thrust of young people in the economy, in universities and colleges, that we're not really that prepared for. Just in Ontario alone, there's an expectation of 250,000 new undergraduate college level students by 2046. So we have these demographic issues, but look at the top one here. Our dependency ratio is changing. So when I came to Canada in 1985, there was about 4 people in the workforce for every person not in the workforce, whether they were too young or too old to be in the workforce, or ill or disabled. Now that number is falling, and we expect it to be 1-to-1 by 2050, which is roughly where Japan is right now. Put it another way, our tax base is going to halve, right? So think about the implications of that for public services, for public-private partnerships, for community growth and development. We're going to have to find new ways of thinking and funding all of our public services. On top of which, we have growing social inequality. So there was all this talk during the pandemic of diversity, equity, and inclusion following the George Floyd business. But I think the challenge for us now is equity and inclusion issues are getting worse, not better. And so one of the leadership challenges we all have, and I'm working with organizations right now, working with one today, about ensuring that diversity is not simply a slogan, but it's a practice. How do we do that in recruitment, in staff development, in investing in partnerships and relationships? There is a global war for talent going on. So at any one time, 800,000 vacancies exist in Canada, and it's not getting any better. People think that, oh, we can solve this problem by throwing money at micro-credentials or new short courses that will give people the skills they need. Nah, it's had no real significant impact. Employers told me in a survey I did for the government of Ontario that they didn't know the difference between a micro-credential and a microwave. I mean, we just don't get thinking right here. And so we can't imagine different ways of working. We're stuck in an old paradigm. What we need is a new one, but nobody's willing to take the risk to make the transition. Where have you heard that story before? So we're competing around the world for people in IT, for people in healthcare, for people in construction. You just talk to my friends in the building trade in Edmonton here and say, where are you getting your framers from? They're shipping them in from Malaysia and from India right now, just on short-term visas to get some work done. Changing patterns of work. The gig economy is very real. I'm in it. This is what I do for a living. I have done for a long time. But the gig economy is growing very fast. In the UK, it's over 1.3 million people are in the gig economy. It's the fastest growing sector of many economies around the world. And so I think, we're going to see a growth of new forms of work. Companies are also going to 4-day weeks. Some companies are going to part-time work for all staff. So you work 5 days, but you don't work the full 8 hours a day. There's all sorts of new patterns of work emerging. And so I think that what we understand work to be, and more importantly, the place of work in our lives is changing dramatically. And the last challenge I want to put on the table before I talk about leadership, and don't panic, I'm not going to talk for the full 14 hours, which is my record, by the way. I want to talk about the importance of community in everything we do, whether you're running a business or a community organization or a government agency. Our understanding of community is very, very important. One of the responsibilities of companies, particularly companies like ATB, companies like Scotiabank, is to invest back in the communities that provide them their revenues and their labor. If they don't, and if they don't do what's expected of them in terms of community, then their brand reputation declines. And so there's a number of examples of this around that we could look at. But I think our notion of what a community is also in transition. It's also in an in-between time. And communities are more divided now than ever. There's newcomers and people who've been here for a while. There are different ethnic communities. I grew up in the city of Bradford in Yorkshire, which my father said, if ever the world had piles, that's where they'd be. But we had, in 1950, when I was born, about 25 Indian Pakistani families. When I left to go to university in 1969, they were a third of the Bradford population. Bradford is now the largest single community of Indian people outside of India in the world. And so that transition of that community created all sorts of racial tensions, all sorts of social and equity issues. Now you look at a place like Calgary or Edmonton, where we have so many newcomers, and it's great, provided we know how to work and live together and partner together to make a difference to each other's lives. And so this Truth and Reconciliation Commission about Indigenous communities in Canada, their relationships to other treaty members, is a symbol that we need to take into our treaty relationships with all these other newcomers that are here. Sorry, not all the other newcomers, all the new groups that we have to connect to in different ways. So what does all this mean? So I want to lay out a kind of big idea that we teach with in our programs at the U of A. What it's led to is kind of 4 behaviors of people, whether they're in the community or in organizations. One of them is there are two dimensions here. One is what's in it for me. I want to know in this future, what's in it for me? I don't care about everybody else. They can go, fly a kite. What's in all this for me? Versus on the other side, how can I be connected and engaged with others in our community? How can I involve other people? So what's in it for me versus this big social engagement, social commitment. The other dimension that we see a lot is, look, I don't want to know anymore. Just make sure I've got what I need, get out the way. Just don't tell me about this climate change. I'm not interested. Don't talk to me about transport infrastructure. I have no interest. Don't talk to me. Just talk to me about the things I care about. Versus, I really want to know how all these jigsaw pieces Steve just talked about fit together. I want to know that so that I can make a difference. Right, so we have these kind of 4 boxes. Wanting to know, but doing so from a selfish point of view, versus wanting to know, wanting to be engaged so that we can act collectively to make a difference. Versus, I don't want to know, and I'm doing everything just for me. I don't care about anybody else. And the 4th box is, I'm kind of interested in connecting with other people, but I don't want to do a lot of it, and I don't want to know a lot. Now, if you're running an organization, whether it's government or any other, you've got all 4 of these boxes in your organization. In a school, for example, we asked some of our school principals that we were working with to document who was in what box. Every school that we were working with, 25 schools, had people in every one of these boxes on the staff. So a leader can't lead on the assumption that everybody wants to know, everybody wants to be engaged. They have to recognize that some of them don't care. So what does leadership in this kind of world look like? Well, let's just pause for a minute and understand that when you read the leadership literature, and I teach this stuff, there are about 10,000, 12,000 books available, written since 1970 on this stuff. And I think it's important to step back and say, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about ways of being, right? Leadership isn't a set of skills, it's a way of being. It's a way of thinking, feeling, doing, and being. So it's about who we are as people. The second thing it's about is making a difference to performance. So you're not, I kept saying when I've been in leadership roles, I was dean of a faculty of business. I ran this large organization. I now run 4 or 5 corporations. And I tell my staff, look, I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to work with you and engage with you and create a culture that continuously outperforms our own thinking about what we were capable of. So pushing the envelope is what leaders should be doing. If you're a kind of, look, I'm just here to keep things moving along, I'm just here to be nice, go find a different job. You're not a leader. You're in middle management somewhere or down the bottom. The first priority of a leader is to look after themselves, to take care of their well-being, their mental health and their physical health. You can't lead from a hospital bed. You can't lead during the period of having a heart attack. And I've sat with, I was coached to 2 CEOs at Barclays Bank. And one of them I asked to take a time out from the job because I was convinced he was not well. And I made him, against his best judgment, go to a cardiologist. He resigned 10 days later with one of the worst cardiac systems that the cardiologist had ever seen. And you can't run a global organization like Barclays Bank if you're not well. And I think one of the other things I've learned in my leadership journey since the 1970s is there are more leaders around than we give credit for. But there's different kind of leaders for different situations. And so situational leadership is very critical to most organizations if they're going to be agile, responsive, creative, and high performing. So we talked about this VUCA world. What I want to say is there are some things that we know work in this work. One of them is that a key job of a leader is to keep reminding colleagues in the organization and those they interact with of what the purpose is. I'm not talking these vision statements, these bullshit vision statements that we all worked on. I'm talking about what is it that we really, really stand for? What's our purpose, not just intellectually, but our heart and mind purpose in doing the work we do? Are we helping all of our staff colleagues think about what they do in terms of its consequences for the future of the organization? So when I worked with Heinz, for example, we were reimagining how Heinz worked in ways that impacted the way in which staff felt about their work and the way in which they felt about the communities they were placed in. But we were trying to say, look, we built really powerful, effective ways of working between us and extended that into the communities we live and work in, we could make a difference to every community Heinz operates in. Every organization needs to be challenged to do more, better, smarter, faster. Not necessarily cheaper, better, smarter, faster. And that's the job. I mean, that's one of the things organizations has to do. And with emerging technologies, it should be possible to do those things, to work smarter, not just harder. Nobody can be a leader on their own. You have to have things called followers. If you're leading from the front and you look behind and there's nobody there, you're not leading, you're in the wilderness having a stroll. So how do we get teams to be built that are powerful and effective both within themselves and across the organization? I mean, this strategic planning stuff everybody gets excited about is basically nonsense. Lots of the strategic plans I've seen that make no sense whatsoever. I inherited the strategic plan for Barclays Visa card operations, which was 6 volumes developed by McKinsey. We replaced them with a small card you could keep in your top pocket that reminded you what the purpose of the organization was. But we also stopped thinking in long, big sequences of change, like over the next 5 years, we're going to bullshit. You're not going to do anything over the next 5 years if you keep thinking like that. Start thinking in sprints. What are you going to do in the next 3 months that will make a big difference to housing or to the healthcare issue that you're dealing with or to rural GP practices? What are you going to do in the next 3 months? And then how can you build on that in the next 3 months? So thinking sprints. And I think good leaders are improv actors because they're always muddling through. Anybody who has a plan and executes it perfectly is probably living in fantasy land. What we need to understand is we all muddle through. Every one of us has had to-do lists that we've never got to as a leader in an organization because stuff happens, or as I like to say, shift happens. So when shift happens, you have to respond and you have to do it now. You don't say, let me take 10 days to have a think about this. No, let's move. And so I think part of leadership is improv theater. And I think that's how we muddle through with purpose, courage, and skill. Now, I wrote this book with Don Simpson, who some of you will know, to say, look, what do we know about leadership, having done all this work over 30 or 40 years? Don created the leadership programs at the BAM Center and has continued to work on that. He's 89. Still working on this stuff, now working at Trent University. And this is what we came up with. We said, look, there are some kind of features of Renaissance leaders, people that are real pathfinders, that we think are very, very much good descriptions of what effective leadership looks like. They're not using their leadership work to work out who am I, where am I going? No, they have a strong sense of self and they have personal mastery. They think about global things and apply their global knowledge and understanding locally. They're not stuck. Even when I worked with a fertilizer company, they kept looking at other products and services. And what can we learn from FedEx? What can we learn from the way GlaxoSmithKline is thinking about mineral exploitation? What can we learn from? They're thinking around cross-boundary learning. trying not to think in a box, but think outside and within the box. They're constantly looking at the future and say, what does the future hold for my sector, my company, my organization, my for-profit, my community network? What does the future look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And what could I do to make that future better for the people I work with and the work we're trying to do? They practice systems thinking. Now, I worked with Peter Senge and worked with lots of other, I worked with lots of people in this space. My master's supervisor wrote books around systems thinking and cybernetics. So I've been in this space since the 1970s. There are very few leaders I've worked with in for-profit, government, or other organizations that are systems thinkers. When you find them, it's like finding a gold mine because they are thinking differently from lots of people around them. So I think systems thinking is a big, big piece. And I keep going back to Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline as a kind of, well, it's not so much a Bible as a handbook to the Holy Land. Leaders I've worked with that make a big difference are passionate about the organization they work for. They really, really care. And they're compassionate about the people they work with. So the passion is about performance, but the compassion is about the people. And we wrote the book with just the first 6, but during the pandemic, Don and I had a series of conversations with leaders around the world in all sorts of sectors, and we added 2 more. One is this idea of courage, that leaders that make a difference are courageous. They often get kind of poo-pooed and stamped on early on or during the attempt to make a transition, but they show the courage to say, no, I think this is right. And so, for example, when I launched the MBA, my colleagues at Athabasca rejected the idea. I went to a meeting of all the deans of business across the country, all 46 of us at the time, and outlined what we were thinking of doing. And everybody laughed and said they'd visit me in prison. So, you know, I mean, the team that I worked with and co-created this thing with had to show a lot of courage and determination just to get through the naysayers to make things happen. And the other thing we added is this notion of Ubuntu, which means that, you know, I am because we are. I wouldn't exist unless we existed as a team. And leadership doesn't exist unless we are. And I think that's a very important idea that is very much South African way of thinking, with different versions of that word in different parts of Africa, but we took the Kenyan description. So I think those are some of the key kind of features of leadership. Just a few more points, and I'm going to shut up and we can chat. I think one of the things that is underestimated in terms of what leaders have to do all the time is manage risk. Some of them are easy. We know some of the risks we have to manage. We know some of the known unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns that really cause the problem. And if we don't get this kind of risk management right, we end up kind of solving the wrong problems or being really good at doing the wrong things better. And there's a lot of examples of that. We're really good at testing students in schools now, better than we've ever done before. It just happens to be the wrong thing to do. So I think, you know, I want to end with this idea of 5 focal points, and then I'll stop. The first is a reinforcement of the importance of purpose. Many organizations forgot why they're there. They don't really know. They're not sure anymore what their purpose is. Take public health. What's its purpose? I think the other kind of big idea is that you can't lead alone. You have to connect with everybody in your organization, but with others around the world who are doing similar work or slightly different work in a different way, so that you are constantly learning. So that connecting is a critical task of leadership. Now, I think leadership, one of the problems that we have is leaders can't give up control. They don't empower down enough. And I've been consulting for organizations where people kind of push up problems so that the CEO or the vice presidents get all the issues because nobody's willing to solve them below. And so you end up in this control spiral where nothing really gets changed or done because everybody's waiting for somebody else to make a big decision. So delegating upwards, not a good plan. Push down. One of the big things, I've just written a book on courage, is that if you're not failing, you're not trying. So if you haven't failed at something, in trying to make a difference, in trying to move forward, in trying to get something to move, then you're not really trying. The trick is how fast you learn that you're failing and how fast you make that failure into an opportunity for success. My old friend Don Skilling, who's sadly no longer with us, used to say, failure is inevitable, but learning from failure is an option. Now, in my book on courage, I kind of outline what we can gain from understanding failures in organizations. My last kind of point is if you're going to be a good leader and you're going to make a difference and your organization is going to thrive, you better have fun at the job. If it's not fun for you, why the heck are you doing this? I mean, I get paid really well for the work I do, but I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it to make a difference. And if I can't have fun doing that, I'm not interested. Maybe that's an age thing. If you're 30 and have just been made CEO of IBM, well, maybe you're quite keen to do it, but it better be fun because otherwise you're going to be miserable, stressed out, and ill. So I think leadership should not only be purposeful, courageous, but fun. So I hope we're going to all muddle through to a different future with purpose, courage, and skill. A few resources. The best book I've read on leadership in a long, long time is this book by Chris Rogers. Chris is a consultant in the UK who I used to work for me, actually, many years ago. But this is a great, practical, useful book. And the others are mine. I have to try sell them somehow, and here they are. I've also just written a novel, but that's not one of these. But I think The Wiggly World of Organizations, Muddling Through with Purpose, Courage, and Skill is a book well worth reading. So thanks for that. I'll shut up. Perry, I'm all yours.
Thank you, Stephen. You could have gone on for the 14 hours or whatever was your record. That was superb. Thank you very, very much. I appreciated the overview that you provided of Canada and the challenges which we face. I don't think there's any question, even before your presentation, that we know we're living in a world of uncertainty where the volatility is considerable. The degree of uncertainty, as was noted, is probably profound. And in your wrap up, the word learning continued to come forth as, no matter what you have experienced, we need to continuously learn. And the challenges we have, I think, continue to reinforce that. Now, whether or not you've arrived at that as a psychologist or simply through your own world of experience, my personal thinking, and I think what we've been doing through the network reinforces many of the messages that you gave, particularly that one on aggregating, of not necessarily knowing what tomorrow is, but being prepared to bring the things together, no matter what emerges. And I thought that was very insightful. And I'm not sure that the rigidities that we have in Canada make us nimble enough to handle the world of uncertainty we've talked about. We've been so confident in our resource sector and so confident as a nation in our public institutions that when the welfare state is challenged, which you've echoed over and over again without saying that specifically, can we afford the welfare state in the future? Are the people really buying in? We seem to become a country of virtue and the social agendas without understanding the relevance of our economy. And I guess that was another point you made. So was I listening? Is there a point that you wanted to reinforce that maybe I didn't highlight my summary?
Well, I think what we're both talking about here is the thinking-doing gap. So, Canada talks a good story, but it doesn't reflect in what we actually do. So we're really good at selling ourselves up. But when you actually look on the ground and say, I mean, the innovation agenda space is a really good one. The university sector talks a fantastic story, which is essentially nonsense. It just doesn't bear. I mean, if universities are so big on innovation, it makes so much economic difference. Why are we productivity flat, declining, depending on which sector you look at? Why is our competitiveness falling? Why can't we convert invention into commercial products? So so thinking, talking, one thing, doing is another. And I think that's a kind of theme across everything I was saying.
Let's pick on the professions for a moment. I mean, the professions really emanate out of our universities. The professions are certainly facing the challenges, not just of AI, but of the rapid changes of technology in itself. If our professions are rigid and primarily driven by administrators, not managers, it seems we have a professional class, which we're very proud of, that are actually the resistors to change. You want to pick up on that?
Right. So look at the legal battle between the engineering profession and digital engineers. Like they're taking them to taking digital engineers to court, saying you can't use that term. And you say, "Oh, come on, grow up." But no, they'll take them to court, and they'll probably win. But what nobody recognizes is, let's take architecture. Only 5% of buildings in North America involve a professional qualified architect. 100% involve an architectural technician. One's trained in a college, the technician, and one's trained at a university, the architect, which led one of the world's famous architects to give this recommendation to people joining the university in London, which is, if you want to be a successful architect, marry very well, because otherwise you'll go bust. Well, now, there are several well-known, famous, wealthy architects, but it's a dying breed because technology is replacing them. In my lifetime, look at CAD/CAM and what that can do. Now look at 3D printing of architectural spaces and models. Now look at the new materials. Look at graphene and what graphene can do. Look at 3D printed houses. What's an architect for?
But what differentiated the architect from the technician is they were presumably the visionary. It was the art and the capacity to innovate, to see a problem through a different lens than the traditional engineer or technician. If what you're saying is so that the profession is dying, it's because the market has no appreciation for innovation.
Well, except Dubai. So, I spent a lot of time in Dubai, and you go there, it's an architect's paradise. There's some weird shapes and buildings there, and they look magnificent. They're completely dysfunctional, but they look terrific. And you say, like, what idiot built, an architect, right? And all the really good functional buildings that Emaar built in Dubai were built primarily through replication of existing buildings elsewhere, right? Hello. So, the world is changing. Take accounting. I've just finished a consulting contract with the CPAs, and that profession is changing very rapidly. New audit systems, AI-based audit systems, which have just been commissioned by the government of Canada to replace a well-known auditing company, which begins with P and has W and C in the title. They're now using an AI system for instant audits and audits as activity takes place. So we can now audit during a transaction rather than subsequent to. So, the game everywhere is changing. Look at healthcare diagnostics. So, I can't imagine any profession untouched by technology other than saddle makers. And that's probably going to change too.
Well, I'm sure when we open up discussion with the viewers, we'll get back to the relevance of generative AI and what it means to the future in the professions. But I want to take you back to what looked like a bit of an oxymoron. You noted that our nation's cities are noted for their place of safety on a global scale, and yet you saw a 47% rise in hate crime. That seems like a bit of an oxymoron, unless we were so good that this increase of 47% was from a very low level. But how do you interpret?
I interpret that as a psychometrician by saying somebody must have changed the definition.
Okay.
and which they did. And we're also better at reporting hate crimes because we feel less inhibited from doing so than before. I'm not saying there hasn't been an increase. There clearly has. And I live here, and one of my clients is Reach Edmonton, Council for Safe Communities. So we're on the edge of some of these issues on a daily basis at Reach. But I think it's a symptom of the larger problem of a transition from a largely Canadian Caucasian base to a multi-ethnic community that we now live in. And as we get to 500,000 immigrants every year, which is less than we actually need to replace the labor force, we're going to see more of these kind of issues. So racial tensions are linked to the whole notion of community change, the transition, the in-between time. And, you know, look at the United States and some of the tensions there. We're going to see more of that here as these changes take place in the structure of communities. When I came to Canada in 1985-6, I started working on school leadership issues with the ATA. A school classroom in St. Albert was not a complex place. I mean, there weren't complex issues in that classroom. That same classroom now probably has people from 15, 20 countries. English is not necessarily the first language in that classroom. And resources to support students with disabilities that are included in that classroom have been taken away. So read Alberta Views in classroom complexity and classroom size this month to see just how big these changes are. So the big issues are around this in-between time that we don't know. We're not actually as good as Canada talks about multiculturalism and the whole notion of trust. The Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out every year and has done for the last 25 years, now says that the most trusted sources of truth are business leaders and non-profit leaders and academics. Nobody else. We don't trust journalism. We definitely don't trust politicians. It never mentions the Welsh and the singing choirs, but you should be able to trust them. But we don't trust other sources of information like social media and so on. And yet, the majority of people get their information from those untrusted sources.
So this decline in trust seems to be reflecting the failure, the excessive expectations that we had on the welfare state. I mean, many of the changes that we're trying to wrestle with and failing are a byproduct of the welfare state said we should feel comfortable with. I mean, the issues of homelessness are the aggregate summary of the failure of being able to make a transition from prison to community, mental health from institution to community, graduates finding they're unemployed. I mean, the list goes on. When you look at the diversity of people sitting under this homeless banner, it seems to me just point to that and you'll see whether or not the welfare state is being challenged and succeeding or not.
We don't have a welfare state, Perry. Finland has a welfare state. So when I was last in Finland, one of my students said to the Prime Minister, "What do you do about homelessness in Finland?" And her answer was classic, "We don't have it." "Why not?" they said. "Well, if we find somebody homeless, we give them somewhere to live." Hello, that's a welfare state. What do? We move the tent from one part of the city to another.
Now, we're going to be addressing that in come October, as you know, and what we're going to address next are the transitions associated with what's happening in public health or in healthcare. I can recall a while back a judge in BC saying waiting is not healthcare, and yet talking to Claire, who had his appendix out last week and spent 10 hours in waiting, or my spouse who spent multiple instances in waiting to get, I won't even go there. It's absurd. So you want to make any reference to, again, a system that is relying on the professions, and yet waiting seems to be the name of the game. And maybe that's what they want. Maybe they like waiting because it calls for more budget.
Healthcare doesn't rely on the profession. Healthcare relies on management.
I'm going to challenge that right now. I don't think we have management in healthcare. I think we have administration, maintaining the status quo. So I think that's one of the fundamental problems we have in healthcare is we don't have management of supply and demand. We have administrators maintaining status quo.
I'll buy that, but it's a very good example of rhetoric and reality. Like we talk this story, this is what the reality is on the ground. I'm currently working with people around rural health and rural surgery. You try to get a C-section in Lethbridge. You can't. There's nobody capable of doing that surgery and no place to do it because they've closed the surgical units. And so we have rotting equipment, we have rotting supplies, we have underskilled professionals. And so we drive people up to Calgary or we helicopter them from Grand Prairie, even though it's got a hospital, to other jurisdictions for certain kinds of surgery. So we have all sorts of issues in health, but it's a system not run by professionals.
Yeah, we've touched on the professionals, we've touched on leadership. We've actually distinguished the expectations of leadership in the private sector, which are driven by the need for profit and or the capacity to draw on investment or sustain, grow, and build, respond to markets. We've talked about public sector and some of the failures and rigidities that are associated with the programs and the uncertainties that lie ahead as it relates to the capacity to fund our public sector. But what about being a politician today? I mean, theoretically, you've been elected, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands or maybe millions have voted you into a position. We don't want to see the politician relying on shift and responding to shift and saying all I am is reacting to everything. Shouldn't politicians, well, talk about leadership in politics today. It's very volatile, as we know. We'll be watching it on television for the next few months.
Yeah. So I grew. My first kind of connection to politics was I was a constituency party secretary for the Labour Party in the UK at the age of 14, and I wrote speeches for Harold Wilson. I'm that old. When I was 16, so I've been involved in politics one way or another from early days. But the dynamic of politics has changed. I used to go to dinners with Jim Callaghan when he was Prime Minister, with Margaret Thatcher and others, the opposition leaders, and there were very friendly occasions. People enjoyed each other's company and they didn't agree with each other, but there was a kind of sharing of understanding of what the concerns were. Even if they didn't agree with the analysis, there was a lot of sharing, a lot of participation, a lot of engagement, a lot of mutual respect. That's gone. And I don't think we have, looking around the world, I can't name a leader I admire. I used to be able to because I worked very closely with Jacinda. I was an advisor to her and Chris Hipkins, who's now the Prime Minister. I worked extensively with Chris, who actually, when he was young, I babysat because I'd been working with his mother for 35 years. And so I actually looked after Chris when he was about 11 while his mother went to a meeting. And now he's the Prime Minister. But Jacinda was somebody I could look up to and say, now there's somebody who shows real courage and passion and conviction and compassion. Chris is fine, but he's a technical politician. And I think, you look at Rishi Sunak, you look at, any politician around the world at the G20 right now and say, which one of these people would you like to invite for dinner and a weekend away? Like none. I don't want to spend any time with any of these people. Jacinda was great fun for a weekend. I spent a weekend with her and her family and other people in the retreat kind of session. So I don't think I look at politicians now with any respect. And I think it's because they have forgotten what the purpose of the work is. And they're not willing to show courage.
Excellent. Well put. We're gonna see the courage that will emanate north, south, east, west over the coming months. It's the world for politicians is volatile on every continent now. I want to come back also to another point that I think you alluded to, and that is, are we in Canada overprotected? it seems to me learning is a byproduct of failing, as you've made that point, meaning, failing is not necessarily a failure. It's a trigger for learning. And if learning is the basis of being able to adapt, then if you're overprotected, you're leaving people vulnerable. Are we as a country overprotected and therefore not innovative, not learning, but passive and championing the status quo?
Finland has a national day of celebration of failure. They have a national holiday to celebrate things that have gone wrong and failed. They have a lot of examples like Nokia, but which is a massive failure. Though it's reinventing itself quite quickly now. But remember, Nokia was a forestry company, and it got into the cell phone business by chance. Because it created cell phone technology so foresters could talk to each other as they worked the forest. And somebody suddenly said, hey, there's an idea. Why don't we sell these? So that's how Nokia started. And then, they lost the plot. They forgot the purpose. They turned down the whole smartphone idea. They said nobody wants this kind of technology in their pocket. And so they were offered that before anybody else, and they turned it down. But I don't think that we in Canada see the future in a clear, crystal sharp way. It's all fudgy. It's all fuzzy. It's all blah. And one of my missions in life is to be blunt and say, look, you have to deal with this stuff. So, for example, in my meeting with my MP, who's now a cabinet minister, I asked him what he was going to do about competitiveness, the war for talent, which is his portfolio, ESDC, what he's going to do about productivity, because that's his portfolio as well. And he didn't have an answer, because I think it's a risk to have an answer, because that would show courage. So I think that what we have is we don't have tango dancers. We have old-fashioned ballroom dancers. We don't have hipsters in politics. We have people who like to sit down and hope things will go away. So I just don't see the courage we need at this moment in our history anywhere in the world to step up and say, this is what we're going to do. What we do get is a lot of rhetoric. So the climate change stuff is a really good example. Canada has committed to all sorts of things year after year for about 30 years and never delivered anywhere near any of the targets we have committed to. So we're not going to hit 2035. I don't care what the government says. It's not going to happen. However, they will do stupid stuff. So we will no longer be able to buy cars that are driven by gasoline, whenever that is. Is it 2030? We will not be able to. I mean, one jurisdiction in BC has just said you can't build any new houses with a gas furnace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we're going to do this stuff because it sounds terrific and important. We're making a contribution. It makes no difference. It's just not at scale. And so we don't have the courage to do the big stuff.
Well,
we can't get the small stuff right.
We were going to grow 2 billion trees.
What, in your back garden? I mean, mine's full.
Yeah, we got a boreal forest with, anyway, gig workers. Let's focus on them for a moment. Some see them as knowledge workers and see the potential of service aggregators taking over the role of large organizations, public and private, recognizing that there's talent out there. And if we know where the talent is, I don't have to own it. They don't have to be my employees. All I need to do is know where they are, pull them together, that's shifting or responding to a shift, and apply them. I spent some time in Taiwan some years ago. I was fascinated to see how quickly an organization could form and be created over the phone or through email in a day.
So one of the contracts I bid on was for Shell, and I led the team that recruited the people that built Shell Caroline. And I was invited to meet the CEO of Shell Canada, who asked me, how many people are in your organization? And I said, how many would you like it to be? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, right now there's me. But by 4 o'clock, I could have 20 people, 50 people, 100 people, depending on what you need. But I think you only need me and maybe two others for a particular period of time for a very specific task. And so we won that contract, and we did this whole creative hiring process. And Shell Caroline came in ahead of budget and ahead of schedule. We did it because I was able to connect with people around the world that could help us get the right people in the right room at the right time. And so I mean, all the corporations I'm currently involved in, there are 6 of them now, created a new one yesterday. All of them are based on the notion of hub spoke. So there's a small group of 1, 2, 3 people at the hub, and the rest of it's gig work that we work. For example, my technology company currently has employees in Afghanistan, Vietnam, and India.
This would certainly shake up the union mentality that we need to have employees, we need to control them from some central body that will represent your interests, meaning some broad sway of an average category of people. It would seem to me if organizations are flattening out, and if, as you say, actually becoming somewhat virtual and forming and unforming based on the opportunity, we've got a very different type of organization. Consulting companies do that today, but they do that in the knowledge economy, not necessarily for producing a new building or fixing infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, it does create issues. So, for example, if you take construction, very few of the construction companies, the large players that build houses or build office blocks or build infrastructure, own the people that frame. What they do is job that out to framing companies, who then job it out to gig workers. So this creates a quality issue, a quality management issue as well. Hence the big issue we have in the city of Edmonton right now, with a massive structure that's deemed unsafe, and everybody's had to move out. So, I mean, it does have consequences. And one of the things that we pay a lot of attention to, and we have done in all the kind of hub-spoke organizations I've co-created, is quality assurance of the process, integrity of the process, and of the product that we actually hand over to clients. So, for example, one of our clients is Scotiabank. If we haven't got security right on our technology products for them, we're gone. Like, it would take one breach, one single incident, we're gone. That's worth a lot of money to us.
That's certainly not public sector speaking. I mean, the world that you're articulating and envisioning, which is flexible, nimble, and adaptive, by being able to pick and choose the talent that you need for the particular moment, is not one of creating jobs. And it would seem to me that over the last century, and we see it in our debt, we see it in the rise of the public sector in Canada, with 50% of the jobs in this country being in the public sector. We've got a world of change in front of us if this country is going to remain productive. And the point was made, do we solve the problem of the dependency simply by having 500,000 people come to Canada next year without any infrastructure to support them? There's another transition and the potential for enormous failure, and the inability not only to handle multiculturalism, but just to accommodate the sheer numbers.
Well, plus we're not very good at matching who's coming in with the skills in demand, and we're pushing with Randy Bozino the idea we should do competency-based assessments before they apply, before they're given a visa, and then we know what skills they have and I don't care about the qualifications; they're kind of meaningless. It doesn't matter where they're from. What I'm interested in is what can they actually do, and this is true for graduates of the University of Waterloo, of U of A, or anybody else. The piece of paper now tells me not very much about capability. If we had competency-based assessment and we saw competency as the currency, then we could actually do a better job of immigration, a better job of matching people with jobs. The other kind of underlying issue, the elephant in the room on the skills agenda, is 42% of the workforce in this country have literacy levels below that required to do the job they're hired to do. So the OECD has a 5-point literacy scale. 42% of Canadian workers are at levels 1 and 2, 96% of all jobs in this country require levels 3, 4, and 5. And our undergraduates and college graduates are not necessarily any better. In fact, there is some evidence that in some colleges and some universities, going to colleges lowers your literacy levels. So, which is shocking. We have some universities in this country, by the way, who have completion rates of below 50%. One of them has a completion rate of 46%. And you say, like, why is this still there? Why hasn't somebody shut this place down? Right? Well, the reason is because it's in Manitoba. So, you're not going to do anything serious in Manitoba. But there's a massive problem with non-completion. 16% of the kids that start the U of A yesterday will not finish their degree ever. And most of that 16% will drop out by Christmas of this year.
So once again, we've seen a public sector, being education, accepting the fact that they are responsible but not accountable.
Yeah. And the universities as well, where we have big criteria for selection. I used to work for a university, Athabasca University, which had one criteria, which is that your check should not bounce. Right? Because we were an open educational institution. And we said, if you want to try, we'll help you. And we'll do whatever it takes to help you get through. We'll even extend how long your learning contract is from 6 months to 10 or 6 months to 14, depending on what your needs are. And sure, we had low completion rates in some programs, but when I was dean, we got completion rates up from 30% in the business program to 70% by doing a better job of supporting and engaging and working with students on things like writing skills and so on. But universities and colleges and schools are now in a game. It's a game. And it's not a great game. We need to change that game. We need a transition there too.
Well, our system in Canada is largely public. I mean, the accountability is the government.
No, it used to be.
Go ahead.
So you have a situation in Ontario where the people of India spend more on funding the college system than the government of Ontario do.
Funding the college system, but so
tuition.
So market forces are coming to play in Ontario in the education.
So you have a college like Northern College where 80% of the students are international students. Okay. 80%. Now, I had lunch with Annette Tremblay yesterday, and she said that her limit for MacEwan is 15%.
Okay.
Right? Because she wants some international students so that everybody has a good kind of cross-cultural experience, but she can't be dependent on that revenue for survival. Queen's University, you may have heard of, it's a little place in Ontario. Queen's made 240 million, had a surplus of 2.4 million in 21-22. In 22-23, they had a 19 million deficit because the number of international students fell. So we're now becoming a precarious system. I've written recently that we have more and more institutions that are permanently failing institutions but survive. Mm-hmm. They offer poor outcomes. They offer, nobody is happy inside or out about what they're doing. But somehow we're incapable of acting to resolve the issues that underlie them. And universities are, in my view, permanently failing organizations.
But those organizations, it seems to me, are primarily driven by what public sector, and that is the politicians or the government in power, wants those institutions to be, not what the citizens want, not what the private sector is seeking, but what the government says those institutions should be held accountable for, if anything.
Or nor are they listening to the faculty, nor are they listening to the administration. So we have the stakeholders, government, faculty, community, students, who are paying a bigger share of the bill, all kind of competing for a view of what the purpose is, right? So we come back to purpose, we come back to courage, we come back to a kind of view of the future that says we need to transition from this view of what we're trying to do to a different one. Now, because of this work I'm doing in Ontario, we had a meeting with the Premier's office in Ontario, who basically said, look, the only purpose of anything to do with colleges or universities help kids get jobs. And you said, like, so you have no clue what goes on in these places then? None whatsoever, do you? Like, you realize that 60% of the students in a college or university are not kids, right? They're in work, they're not 19. This is some kind of fantasy that we had back in the 70s. No, this is not a description of what a university or college is anymore. But the Premier's office is insistent that the only purpose of a college or university is help people get good jobs.
Well, that seems to be what the government's view is of the economy. As long as we've got full employment, doesn't matter whether or not we're productive. We've got full employment because we just hired another 25,000 in Alberta under one party. I won't even go there. I want to pick up on information overload. The point you made earlier, that purpose, etc., span, courage, fun, but on span, one might say, look, with the information we have today, span is easy. I can see the globe. I can know when there's a tornado in Tasmania. Is information overload becoming one of the issues that leaders are facing? That point was made by Randall. He's concerned that a lot of the rhetoric and loss of courage and fuzzy vision is because they've become so overloaded with so much information they can't get their priorities straight.
So I had this great job working for one of the big breweries in the UK when I ran the UK consulting company. And I love this job because I have been drinking their beer since I was, 12. So one of the things I noticed was they had 1,600 measures of their performance that the management team was expected to look at every week. They didn't ask two questions. Do you like this beer? Would you buy it again? Like, hello. So less is more, right? So one of the things we did was, what are the 5 key indicators that you need to have that will predict performance, not just tell you what happened last week? Who cares? What are so we worked with them, and then I worked with Tesco, and I worked with other large retailers in the UK. And one of the things we discovered, and based on a piece of research that Harvard did, was the best predictor of profitability in a retail operation is employee satisfaction. It's a 1% gain in employee satisfaction at Tesco's led to a 5% gain in profit and a 2% gain in share value within 6 months. So we measured employee satisfaction weekly, sampling. They had 425,000 employees, so sampling employees was easy. So we sampled 1,000 a week, and we're able to predict share prices and return on capital and sales per square foot better than any other predictor they'd ever seen. And we reduced the number of indicators everybody's looking at from, in the case of Tesco, from 50 to 6.
I'm going to come back to you in a second, Greg. I want to make, that's an excellent insight. I'll share with you a personal experience. When I was in public sector, one of the things that we did introduce in a fairly large organization of like 5,000 people, we did job satisfaction surveys quarterly, brought them to the attention of management. And for the organization who were having difficulty, we knew where to deploy some management assistance to those where job satisfaction was failing. What we learned over time was that the primary contributor to job satisfaction was the relationship they had with their supervisor. Not salary, etc. The second insight out of that was the primary contributor in job satisfaction surveys is conducting the survey itself, because it says that you care.
Yeah,
that was Eisenhower's phenomenal power as a leader. Is the doughboys, the troops felt that he cared as an individual about their welfare. And that's
I work for an organization in Edmonton here as ombuds, and one of my jobs is to randomly call staff on a monthly basis and ask, how are things going with you and the organization? What's working, what's not working, what needs to change? It's a small organization, just 25 people, but everybody gets called twice a year. And it's a one-on-one chat with me, confidential. And then I summarize it, and it's led to major changes in how the organization functions. And I think that kind of, you can't underestimate the value of that kind of work. But we did have a question. I saw somebody's.
That was Greg. Greg, make sure you're unmuted. Let's hear what your question is. And then
Just wanted to build on that, Stephen. Both you and Perry talked about employee satisfaction as defined by how happy you are at work, or what's the measure?
We used a kind of version of the Gallup 12. So
okay, so exactly what I wanted to ask about. Gallup measures something called employee engagement, which is and that actually is proven to double performance if you have it. And they define it in 2 words: emotional connection.
And the biggest single item is, do you have a best friend at work?
Absolutely. So I just wanted to probe into that a little bit, because
we added a couple of questions to that reflected the Tesco environment.
Excellent. But the Q12 is, they've been measuring employee engagement around the world for 30 years. And they've got the research.
And the nice thing about it is, if you pay the money, and Tesco did, you can benchmark yourself against other companies in the same sector or in similar kind of retail sectors. So that's some of the things we did. I also introduced that when I was vice president at Athabasca. We hadn't had an employee survey for 5 years when I got back there. And I said, what are you guys doing? Come on, smarten up. And the HR director said, oh, that's a good idea. I thought, what the? So I did the Q12 with the staff there, which was very revealing. And we were able to benchmark against 6 other universities around the world.
Randall noted that the Western diversification in the federal government had the highest job satisfaction rating in the entire federal service. And in response to why, it was one of the smallest departments, with the headquarters located outside of Ottawa. And he said, we gave out the money. Now, I don't know whether they gave out the money to the staff. I think he's making the point we gave out money to other organizations. But
also the other thing about that organization that Randall used to be part of is they hired some really smart people. So it was one of the fun organizations to connect with and to do business with. I did.
Is that a recent finding? Because Justin Reamer wound up there for a little while.
Oh yeah, well, and I knew the founder, Bruce. He was my boss for a few years. We've got only a few more minutes left, so I'm going to look for any other hands. Thank you, Greg, for your question. Most, by the way, Stephen, have been asking questions through me via the chat function. So thank you, Mel, and thank you, Randy, and thank you all of those that have put in questions out there that I've been passing on. But if I don't see any other hands, I'm going to reinforce one of my takeaways. Randall, I don't know why we've got just your picture up on the front, but you're looking good, and I love that background. I'd like to get Stephen back up on the screen. Can you do that, Claire? Well, maybe it's only on my screen. One of my takeaways, Stephen, is the relevance of learning. And maybe that's your background in psychology and taking that and applying it to organizations or countries as a whole. But when you're in an environment that's changing rapidly, or when you're failing or faced with failing, it would seem to me that the one ingredient that human beings are blessed with is the capacity to learn and to embrace the relevance of learning as a lifelong endeavor and critical to organizations going to survive. If only BlackBerry had learned, and if we would only have learned from its failures, or the failures of Lougheed, when Lougheed made the various investments which he did in corporations in Alberta, which actually helped empower Calgary's economy to diversify. Stephen, I'll be deleting that from the sum up, but I want to thank you very, very much. You exceeded my expectations enormously. I look forward to our next breakfast together, but this was superb. You've shared a great deal with us, much more than I and I'm sure the audience possibly could have expected. So I thank you for being brave and sharing with us your stories of how early you started drinking. the various affairs and organizations that you've helped throughout the world. So you've been a great contributor to this session and a great contributor to Canada's welfare. So thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today. Take care.